Yeah, if you so a cluster is defined in our mind as a geographical cluster up to a 100-mile radius, and there's a consistent thread that runs through those disappearances. We'll talk about 60 miles west of Mount Shasta as you go towards the coast. There's a small town called Gasquet. It's Gasquet, French name. And in the old days, in the late 1800s, early 1900s, there was a series of miners that had 50 to 100 mines scattered throughout the perimeter of the Marble Mountain Wilderness area and the region bordering Oregon. So in the late 1800s, everyone sort of kept track of everybody. And slowly, the miners started to disappear. And I don't mean they came into town and they dropped their belongings, sold them, and took off. I mean they disappeared. People would find the mine, but there was nobody there. Their belongings were there. Their guns were there. They were gone. And there were up to 30 of these miners that disappeared in the late 1800s, early 1900s that were never found. No graves. They weren't robbed. They were gone. And this was noted in the Crescent Valley newspaper at the time and as an oddity. So you fast a lot of the clusters that I write about, there's a historical tie, as there is in Crater Lake, to disappearances. This isn't a phenomenon that's just occurred in the last 10 years. This has usually occurred over a long-term period of time. So in the Mount Shasta cluster, it's tied to this coastal region near Gasquet where the miners vanished. Well, in Mount Shasta, there's two highly unusual events that occurred in 1999 and in 2000. And they both involved older people, a guy named Carl Landers, who was 69, and an individual named Rosemary Kunst, who was 70. Different events, different locations. Carl was with some buddies that he had known for a number of years, and they wanted to climb Mount Shasta. And understand that Mount Shasta is climbed hundreds and hundreds of times, and you don't need to be a star athlete to do it. It's a tough climb, but you can do it. And Carl was with some friends, and one of them was a retired airline pilot who flew fighters or flew in the Air Force and was a really well-rounded person, and another individual who ran an import business out of San Francisco. So they left. They started to climb the mountain, and they stopped in an area where everyone stops before they make the final ascent, and it's in an area of a small lake. Well, that night, they didn't quite make the lake. They set up their little tent in a little cove up against the mountain near some boulders. And they spent the night there sleeping away, and it got a little windy. And Carl wasn't feeling 100%. He had some diarrhea that they thought might be due to the altitude pills that he was taking for acclimating to the conditions. But he left the tent a couple of times for diarrhea. He came back, and early in the morning, he said he didn't feel good, but he could still make it. So even though these guys were older, they were pretty good athletes. Carl used to run every day, and he was a good athlete. Although he hadn't made this climb before, others with him had. So early in the morning, they were picking up the tent, and two of the guys who were picking up the tent told Carl, hey, go around the turn, go 800 feet, and you're going to hit the lake, wait there, and we'll be right there. And if you understand the area, there's one very, very defined trail that runs along the side of Shasta that goes straight to the lake. There is nothing else you can do. There are no other choices. It is very evident where you're going, etc. Carl says, okay. The guys, 15, 20 minutes later, get the tent done. They take off. They head around the corner and go to the lake. They get to the lake, and there's a ranger assigned there because there's so many people that camp at this lake at night before they ascend. And he kind of keeps track of everybody. And they stopped at the ranger, and they said, hey, did you see this guy? And he says, no. They say, you sure? Well, there's only one guy that took off, and they saw this guy up the hill, and they knew that wasn't Carl. So they walked back and forth 3 or 4 times, and then one of them decided to go up the mountain a little further. Make a long story short, they finally give up, And, by the way, Carl had left his supplies, along with a lot of other guys left their supplies with that tent in that area. So they went back, and all the tents and sleeping supplies were still at that area where they had left it. And so they decided, well, they better get some help. And so they called Shasta County Search and Rescue. They called California Search and Rescue. And a very grisly guy named Grizz Adams was running the search operations. He'd been doing this for 30 years. I spoke to Grizz about this personally. I met with him. And again, it's one of those times he goes, Dave, how did you ever hear about this story? This 35 plus years, I've never had this happen to me. He says, we were all over that mountain. He goes, Carl was not on the mountain, Dave. We brought canines in. They didn't pick him up. We flew it. We dropped guys at the summit, 14,000 plus feet. They came down all sides. They couldn't find him. They talked to people who were on the mountain. They didn't see him. They said, Dave, there's snow around the path where he was, and nobody went outside the path. I said, what happened to him, Grizz? He says, Dave, it's $1 million question. He either went up or he went in, but he's not on it. And Carl Landers, to this day, has never been found. They never found a piece of his. He was carrying climbing equipment, boots, an axe, all the things that a climber would have who would go up Shasta. None of that stuff was ever found. His car was still at the bottom. It's one of the greatest whodunits ever found anywhere in that area. The other one involves a woman named Rosemary Kunst. Disappeared August 18th, in 2000. She was 70 years old. Rosemary went through a pretty tough portion of her life. Her and her husband, a few years before that, were in an accident, and the husband died in the accident. She was looking for some type of spiritual retreat and getting into the mountains, and she found a Native American organization that gave tours up to a lake in the Marble Mountain Wilderness called Spirit Lake. Spirit Lake is a very gorgeous setting. Sits somewhat in a bowl area with a lot of trees on one end, no trees at the other end. Almost looks like, again, a little small volcano. And she went up there with a handful of other people and a Native American chief. And they went up there for, I forgot if it was 3 or 4 days. But during the time, the Native Americans would bring everyone to the altar at night, and they would sing spirit dances. And they would talk to the gods, and the people supposedly had this event happen to them where they can talk to their spirits, and she could reach out to her husband, etc. And the next day, after this event, the chief said that he was going to take a group over to another lake short distance away, and Rosemary said that she was going to stay behind. And the chief's son, who was 12 years old then, she asked the boy, hey, do you want to go with me over to the other side of the lake and have a picnic? And the boy says no. Well, the cook that was there, she asked the cook if he would make her a lunch, and she would be back after she ate the lunch. He said, no problem. He made the lunch. She said goodbye to the boy, and she walked around this perimeter of the lake. Now understand, you and me and nobody else is going to walk outside the perimeter of this lake. The sides of it are very steep, rugged, etc. You stay inside the confines. There's no place to go. They all see her walk inside the bowl and go to the other side, and they lose her in a series of trees. 4 or 5 o'clock comes back. Everyone arrives back at camp, and Rosemary's not back. So they send a couple people out to look, and they don't find anything. It's like she was never there. And they come back. The Native American chief gets out a sat phone and calls for help. The cavalry arrives, and they start to search. And this is another Grizz Adams search. Grizz says, Dave, damn, these are the 2 times in my career where I have no answers. And he said, this woman, we talked with the family, she was mentally in great health. And this is a point that everyone should remember. She asked the boy to go with her to have the picnic, so you know that she was not suicidal. Even if she was suicidal, there's no place to go. If she drowned, they would have found her in the lake. She wasn't in the lake. She couldn't have gotten outside the confines, and even if she did, they would have found her because there's nothing but huge boulders on the other side. There's one outlet where the lake dumps into this small little ravine that's extremely steep going down the other side. And Grizz said they had guys in mountain gear going down, looking inside boulders on this cliff. Dogs never reacted to anything. They couldn't find her. They never did find her. It's another one of those cases where there's nothing.
You've had great success in developing good, trusting relationships with Native Americans, the Hoopa tribe that you investigated, Bigfoot sightings and things of that sort. I'm curious, and you just mentioned one particular Native American chief. Were you able to talk to them about the general premise? Is there anybody who gave you any insight into what the heck is going on? Do they have a take on it?
Oh, that's a great question. And I'm the chief that was running the event where the lady disappeared at Spirit Lake, Rosemary. He was equally perplexed, but he did say that he thought that Rosemary wanted to go back. And he said that there was a point where he was at the lake and two eagles flew over together, and to him that indicated that she was back with her husband. And I said, well, where do you think she went? And he said, I think she went to a place called Devil's Back Mountain, which brings up another point that I talk about in both books. There's a lot of there are several times where people disappear in an area where it has a strange name. And for anyone who knows a lot about the mountains or mapping, locations on maps get names for a reason. And, if it's Mill Creek, there's probably a mill on that creek at one time. If it was Frank's Pass Creek, well, Frank Pass may have lived on that creek 100 years ago. Well, there's a couple times in this book, well, many times, where Devil's Valley, Devil's Mountain, Devil's Nest, these are the places where people are disappearing. And I say in the book, the reason it has that name is for a reason. And I don't understand the reason most of the time, but I do know that these names come up way too frequently. And when the chief said that Rosemary disappeared and probably went to Devil's Back Ridge, I'm thinking, wow, is that coincidental?
There is one case in the Missing 411 Eastern U.S. book, a Michigan case that you highlighted and mentioned to me because you knew it would be of interest to me in particular about this girl named Katie Flynn in Michigan, 3 years old.
That case is one of the most, how would you describe it?
I don't know. It's kind of chilling, and it goes to the heart of a mystery that I've sort of pursued on my own. But go ahead and tell it.
So in 1868, in northern Michigan, near a city called Walhalla, her dad, a guy named Henry Flynn, ran a lumber camp. And his daughter was 3 years old, could just walk, and couldn't walk too well. But she would, up this hill, the dad would get trees and do the milling, etc. And then the horses would drag the cart with the lumber down to the bottom of the hill, and Katie would get off, and then she'd run back to the top of the hill for another ride down. And I don't know how many times a day she did this, but she did it a lot. And at one point, the dad went back to the top of the hill, and Katie wasn't there. And he started to get frustrated, and he started looking around, and in a very, very odd coincidence, as they're running around looking for Katie, two hunters show up. And everyone's screaming, looking for Katie, blah, blah, blah. And these hunters start helping Mr. Flynn look for his daughter. So as they're searching, they hear this kind of, it was described in the article as a feeble cry inside dense brush miles from where they were. And as they walk up on this little cry, they see what they think is a giant bear jump from the location where Katie was at into the river and absolutely fly through the river and disappear. So when Mr. Flynn gets his daughter, he says, when we were calling you, why didn't you come back to us? And she said, it wouldn't let me. And Mr. Flynn says, well, what do you mean it wouldn't let you? Mr. Wolf wouldn't let me. And he goes, well, what do you mean Mr. Wolf wouldn't let you? He says, what happened to your hat? And she says, the wolf ate it. And he goes, what do you mean the wolf ate it? He took it off my head, and he ate it in front of me. He says, well, did you get anything to eat? And she says, yeah, the wolf got some berries for me and put it in its paw and handed it to me. And Mr. Flynn's a pretty smart guy, just like you and I are really brilliant. Well, gee, a wolf couldn't hold berries in its hand. But she was pretty adamant that it was a wolf. And this goes on, and there's there's a couple different stories over the years that don't wander too far from what was told, but in general, the story is pretty convincing that the way Katie described it probably happened pretty similar to that. These miners that disappeared in the late 1800s, early 1900s that were never found. No graves. They weren't robbed. They were gone. And this was noted in the Crescent Valley newspaper at the time and as an oddity. So you fast a lot of the clusters that I write about, there's a historical tie, as there is in Crater Lake, to disappearances. This isn't a phenomenon that's just occurred in the last 10 years. This has usually occurred over a long-term period of time. So the cluster is defined in our mind as a geographical cluster up to a 100-mile radius, and there's a consistent thread that runs through those disappearances. We'll talk about 60 miles west of Mount Shasta as you go towards the coast. There's a small town called Gasquet. It's Gasquet, French name. And in the old days, in the late 1800s, early 1900s, there was a series of miners that had Mount Shasta cluster. It's tied to this coastal region near Gasquet where the miners vanished. Well, in Mount Shasta, there's two highly unusual events that occurred in 1999 and in 2000. And they both involved older people, a guy named Carl Landers, who was 69, and an individual named Rosemary Kunst, who was 70. Different events, different locations. Carl was with some buddies that he had known for a number of years, and they wanted to climb Mount Shasta, 50 to 100 mines scattered throughout the perimeter of the Marble Mountain Wilderness area and the region bordering Oregon. So in the late 1800s, everyone sort of kept track of everybody. And slowly, the miners started to disappear. And I don't mean they came into town and they dropped their belongings, sold them, and took off. I mean they disappeared. People would find the mine, but there was nobody there. Their belongings were there. Their guns were there. They were gone. And there were up to 30 of them. And understand that Mount Shasta is climbed hundreds and hundreds of times, and you don't need to be a star athlete to do it. It's a tough climb, but you can do it. And Carl was with some friends, and one of them was a retired airline pilot who flew fighters or flew in the Air Force and was a really well-rounded person, and another individual who ran an import business out of San Francisco. So they left. They started to climb the mountain, and they stopped in an area where everyone stops before they make the final